Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most elaborate deceptions. A con game so masterful, so perfectly disguised that it fooled entire civilizations for over 1,000 years. Picture this. What if I told you that every fairy tale ending you've ever believed in, every romantic royal wedding you've swooned over, was actually part of the greatest scam in human history? What if those beautiful princess gowns were really chains, and those golden crowns were actually price tags? Tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain on medieval royal marriages, and I promise you, what you're about to discover will change how you see every Disney movie forever. Now, before we dive into this royal rabbit hole together, I'd love it if you could hit that like button, but only if tonight's story truly captivates you. And hey, if you're someone who loves uncovering the hidden truths behind history's most beautiful lies, that subscribe button is calling your name. I'm genuinely curious. Are you listening to this tucked in bed, maybe with a cup of tea? Or perhaps you're taking a late-night walk under the stars? Drop a comment and let me know where this story finds you tonight. Your stories always make my day. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time together. Anders, we live in an age where we complain about dating apps. We swipe left, we swipe right, we ghost people after 3 dates. We think modern romance is complicated, don't we? But imagine if your parents could legally sell you to a complete stranger when you were still learning to walk. Imagine if your first kiss was scheduled by a diplomatic committee and your wedding night was a public spectacle witnessed by dozens of strangers. Welcome to medieval royal marriage where love was a luxury no one could afford, and every I do was really saying, I surrender. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. Medieval royal marriages weren't romantic unions. They were business mergers. They weren't about finding your soulmate. They were about expanding your empire. And the bride? She wasn't a princess finding her prince. She was inventory being transferred from one warehouse to another. Let me paint you a picture that'll make your skin crawl. In 1160, a little girl named Margaret was born in Scotland. She was beautiful, they said, sweet-natured. She probably loved playing with dolls, maybe chasing butterflies in the castle gardens. Normal kid stuff, right? But by the time Margaret turned 3 years old, she was already engaged to be married. Not to another child, mind you, to Henry, the young king of England who was already a grown man planning military campaigns. 3 years old, and her entire future was sold and sealed with a handshake between two men who probably couldn't even pronounce her full name correctly. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. See, here's the thing about medieval royal families. They didn't see their children as children. They saw them as assets. Living, breathing chess pieces in a game of political monopoly that spanned continents. Every royal baby born came with an invisible price tag hanging around their neck, and that price was calculated not in gold, but in strategic value. Think about it. If you're a medieval king, your daughter isn't your little princess who needs bedtime stories and scraped-knee kisses. She's your most valuable trading card. She's a potential peace treaty with legs. She's your ticket to claiming someone else's kingdom or your insurance policy against being invaded yourself. The cold, hard truth? Love was the enemy. Genuine affection between royal spouses was actually dangerous because it meant the couple might start making decisions based on their hearts instead of their kingdom's needs. And that, my friends, was a luxury medieval politics simply couldn't afford. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine you're 8 years old playing in your backyard, and suddenly your parents call you inside. Sweetie, they say, we've got wonderful news. You're getting married next month to someone you've never met in a country you can't pronounce where they speak a language you don't understand. Isn't that exciting? That was reality for royal children, except there was no next month. These engagements often happened in infancy, with the actual ceremonies taking place years later, sometimes decades. These kids grew up knowing their entire adult life had already been scripted by strangers, and they had no say in editing the plot. But here's where it gets really twisted. Medieval royal marriages weren't just arranged, they were performed with all the pageantry of a genuine love story. The white dress, the beautiful ceremony, the celebration afterwards. Everyone played along with the romantic fantasy because, well, it made the bitter pill of political manipulation so much easier to swallow. It was theater, pure elaborate theater designed to make a property transaction look like a fairy tale. And the most heartbreaking part? Many of these royal brides and grooms never even met their spouses until their wedding day. Can you imagine your first conversation with a person you're legally bound to spend your entire life with happens at the altar, probably in front of hundreds of strangers, while wearing the most uncomfortable outfit you've ever put on? Some couples were luckier. They might exchange a few letters beforehand, maybe a portrait, but even those portraits were basic
Medieval Photoshop. Court artists were hired to make everyone look like a Renaissance Instagram filter had blessed them from birth. One particularly brutal example. In 1396, 6-year-old Isabella of Valois was married to 29-year-old King Richard II of England. The age gap alone should make your stomach turn. But here's the kicker. This marriage was specifically designed to end a war between England and France. Little Isabella wasn't walking down the aisle to meet her Prince Charming. She was walking down the aisle to seal a ceasefire agreement. She was a living, breathing peace treaty in a pretty dress. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely some of these marriages worked out. Surely some couples found love eventually. And you know what? Some did. But here's the thing. When love did bloom in royal marriages, it was purely accidental. It was a happy side effect, not the goal. And when it did happen, it often caused more problems than it solved, because personal happiness and political necessity rarely aligned perfectly. The system was designed to fail the individuals within it while serving the greater political machine. And it worked flawlessly for centuries. But I know what you're wondering right now. If medieval royal marriages were such obvious scams, such blatant examples of treating people like property, why did everyone just go along with it? Why didn't anyone stand up and say, "This is wrong"? Why didn't the children themselves rebel against a system that was stealing their most basic human right, the right to choose who to love? Well, here's where our story gets even more heartbreaking. Because the answer reveals something profound about how power works, how control is maintained, and how human beings can be systematically taught to surrender their own dreams. The truth is, these royal children didn't just accept their fate passively. They were actively trained from the moment they could understand language to believe that love itself was their enemy. And the methods used to break their spirits, they were more sophisticated and more cruel than anything you could imagine. The answer to those questions is more chilling than you might expect. Because medieval royal families didn't just accidentally stumble into a system that crushed their children's dreams. They perfected it. They turned the destruction of love into an art form, a science, a carefully orchestrated process that began before these children could even speak. Picture this. You're 3 years old, and instead of bedtime stories about brave knights rescuing princesses, you're told tales about princesses who saved kingdoms by marrying wisely. Instead of fairy tales about true love's kiss, you hear legends about queens who brought peace through strategic alliances. Your lullabies aren't about romance, they're about duty, honor, and the greater good. This was the reality for royal children. From their very first words, they were fed a carefully crafted narrative that love was selfish, that personal desires were weakness, and that their highest purpose was to serve as tools of statecraft. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1203 that perfectly illustrates this psychological conditioning. When Princess Blanche of Castile was just 9 years old, she was given a wedding doll, a miniature bride figure dressed in the colors of France. But this wasn't a toy. It was a training device. Every day, little Blanche
They thought they were protecting their sons and daughters from the chaos of emotional choice. Medieval philosophy taught that strong emotions were literally dangerous to one's health and soul. Love, they believed, made people irrational, unpredictable, and therefore unfit to rule. King Louis VII of France wrote in a letter to his brother, "I save my children from the burden of passion as I would save them from plague or poison. Better they should live in peace without love than die in chaos with it." He wasn't being cruel. He was being what he thought was protective. But what he didn't understand was that by removing love, he wasn't creating peace. He was creating a different kind of chaos, the chaos of living a life that never felt fully real. Now, you might be wondering, didn't any of these children fight back? Didn't anyone refuse to go along with the program? And here's where our story takes a fascinating turn, because some did rebel, but their rebellions revealed just how deeply the system had infiltrated their psyches. When royal children did resist their arranged marriages, they rarely argued for the right to choose their own partners. Instead, they asked for better arranged marriages, or they begged to enter religious life where marriage could be avoided altogether. They'd been so thoroughly convinced that love was impossible for people like them that they couldn't even imagine it as an option worth fighting for. Princess Constance of Antioch provides a perfect example. In 1130, at age 15, she staged what historians call the most dramatic royal rebellion of the 12th century. She barricaded herself in her chambers, refused to eat, and declared she would never submit to matrimonial slavery. Sounds like a love rebellion, right? But when negotiators finally got her to explain her demands, she wasn't asking for the right to marry for love. She was asking for the right to choose which strategic marriage would best serve her kingdom's interests. She'd been so thoroughly trained to think politically that even her rebellion was framed in terms of statecraft. She literally couldn't conceive of marriage as anything other than a political transaction. The system had succeeded in making her forget that any other kind of union was even possible. But here's what the royal families didn't count on. Human nature is remarkably stubborn. Love, it turns out, is like water. If you try to block it completely, it finds the most unexpected ways to seep through the cracks. And when it does break through in a medieval royal court, the results could be absolutely explosive. Some princes and princesses did fall in love, deeply, desperately, dangerously in love. And when that happened, they faced a choice that would define not just their own lives, but the entire course of European history. Surrender to the system that had shaped them since birth, or risk everything for the radical act of choosing their own hearts. As we're about to discover, when royal love became rebellion, it didn't just change individual lives. It toppled kingdoms, started wars, and rewrote the very rules of power itself. Because it turns out that love, when it's been suppressed long enough, doesn't just whisper when it finally breaks free, and it roars. And medieval Europe was about to learn just how loud that roar could be. That roar we talked about, it first echoed through the stone halls of Windsor Castle on a cold February morning in 1464. When 18-year-old King Edward IV of England did something so shocking, it was absolutely unthinkable that it sent tremors through every royal court in Europe. He fell in love. Real, genuine, head over heels, can't eat, can't sleep love. And then he did something even more scandalous. He acted on it. Egmont was supposed to marry a French princess. The negotiations had been going on for months. Treaties were being drafted, dowers calculated. But Edward had a problem. He'd met Elizabeth Woodville, a widow with 2 children who was absolutely, completely politically useless to him. She couldn't bring him a single acre of land, not one military alliance, not even a decent trade agreement. She was just beautiful and kind. And when she laughed at his jokes, he felt something he'd never experienced before. The pure, terrifying joy of being liked for himself, not for his crown. So what did Edward do? He married her in secret. At dawn, with only her mother and a priest as witnesses, the King of England literally snuck out of his own castle to elope like a lovesick teenager, knowing full well it could cost him his throne. When the news broke, the reaction was swift and absolutely brutal. The French ambassador wrote to his king, "The English have gone mad. Their boy king has confused his kingdom for a romance novel." Parliament seriously considered declaring Edward mentally unfit to rule. His own mother publicly stated she wished she'd never given birth to him. But here's what makes Edward's story so fascinating. He didn't just defend his choice, he celebrated it. At his official wedding announcement, he stood before the entire court and said something that no medieval king had ever dared to say. "I have married for love, and I would rather be a happy commoner than a miserable king." The silence that followed was so complete that courtiers later described it as the sound of an entire worldview cracking. Because Edward had just committed the ultimate royal crime. He'd suggested that personal happiness might be more important than political duty. He'd chosen his heart over his kingdom. And somehow, the kingdom didn't collapse. England didn't fall into chaos. The sun still rose the next morning. And that terrified the other royal families of Europe more than any military threat ever could. But Edward's love rebellion was just the beginning. Once that crack appeared in the system, other royal hearts began to follow the light seeping through, and some of their stories will make you believe in the power of love to literally reshape the world. Take Prince Pedro of Portugal. In 1355, he was arranged to marry Constanza of Castile, for obvious political reasons. But Pedro had already fallen desperately in love with Inez, a Spanish noblewoman who served in Constanza's court. The situation was impossible. Pedro couldn't break his engagement without starting a war, but he also couldn't marry Constanza while his heart belonged to someone else. So he found a third option that nobody saw coming. He married Constanza as planned, fulfilled his political duty, gave England an heir, and then, after Henry died, he secretly married Inez and lived the rest of his life for love. His strategy was essentially, "Fine, I'll be your political pawn for a few years, but then I'm taking my life back." And it worked. Her secret marriage to Owen Tudor produced children who would eventually found the Tudor dynasty, meaning that some of England's greatest monarchs, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, descended from a love marriage that was supposed to be impossible. Catherine literally changed the course of English history by refusing to let politics permanently crush her heart. But these love rebellions didn't just affect individual lives. They started a revolution in how medieval society thought about marriage, choice, and the relationship between personal happiness and social duty. Because when royal children started choosing love over politics, it sent a message to every other young person in the kingdom. Maybe you don't have to accept the life other people planned for you either. Suddenly, merchant families were allowing their children more say in marriage choices. Noble houses were considering compatibility alongside dowries. The idea that love might be a legitimate factor in life decisions started spreading through medieval society like a love song. But the established powers didn't give up without a fight. The more royal children rebelled for love, the more elaborate and cruel the system's responses became. And what happened next reveals just how far medieval institutions would go to maintain control over young hearts. Because if you think the training we talked about earlier was intense, wait until you hear about the lengths royal families went to when they realized their children were starting to fight back. The countermeasures they developed were so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating that they make modern propaganda look like amateur hour. And the children caught in this escalating war between love and power were about to face choices that no human being should ever have to make. Those impossible choices began to materialize almost immediately after
Edward IV's love rebellion sent shockwaves through medieval Europe. The royal establishments across the continent realized that they were facing their worst nightmare. Their carefully constructed system was beginning to crack, and love was seeping through those cracks like water through a dam. Their response was swift, systematic, and absolutely ruthless. Welcome to what I call the medieval dating app from hell. Except this wasn't about finding love. It was about preventing it so thoroughly that royal children would never even dream of Edward IV's rebellion. You see, the old system had a fatal flaw. It allowed royal children to meet potential love interests at court, at ceremonies, during diplomatic visits. Those chance encounters, those stolen glances across a banquet hall, those conversations during a dance, they were creating exactly the kind of emotional connections that led to disasters like Edward's secret wedding. So the royal families got creative, terrifyingly creative. In 1470, just 6 years after Edward's scandalous marriage, the French court implemented what they called the Portrait Protocol. From that point forward, royal children weren't allowed to meet their intended spouses until the actual wedding day. Instead, they would be shown painted portraits and given written descriptions of their future partners. But here's where it gets diabolical. These portraits were essentially medieval propaganda pieces designed to make the children fall in love with political arrangements rather than actual people. Princess Anne of Brittany's experience perfectly illustrates how this system worked. In 1488, when she was 11 years old, she was shown a portrait of Maximilian of Austria, her intended husband. The painting depicted a handsome, noble-looking man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Anne was also given a beautifully written letter, supposedly from Maximilian, expressing his excitement about their future together and his admiration for her intelligence and beauty. Anne spent 3 years writing letters to this portrait, essentially falling in love with a fantasy. She developed elaborate daydreams about their life together, planned their conversations, even practiced what she would say when they finally met. The reality? When Anne finally met Maximilian on her wedding day, she discovered that the portrait had been painted 20 years earlier, when he was young and attractive. The real Maximilian was now middle-aged, overweight, and suffering from what medieval physicians called melancholia, basically severe depression. The romantic letters, they'd been written by professional scribes who specialized in creating fake romantic correspondence, and had been catfished by the entire medieval political system. But the portrait scam was just the beginning. Royal courts began developing what we might call emotional isolation protocols, designed to prevent their children from forming any meaningful relationships that might compete with arranged marriages. Take the case of Prince Charles of Anjou in 1485. When Charles turned 14, the age when medieval boys typically began forming friendships and romantic interests, his father implemented something called the rotation system. Charles was never allowed to spend more than 2 weeks in the same location. He'd stay at one castle for a fortnight, then be moved to another, then another, then another. The official reason? To broaden the young prince's education and understanding of his future territories. The real reason? To prevent him from forming any lasting emotional bonds with anyone. Every time Charles started to connect with someone, a fellow page, a young lady of the court, even a mentor figure, he'd be whisked away before the relationship could deepen. Charles's private tutor wrote in a letter that survived in monastery archives, "The young prince has become like a ghost in his own life, present but never truly settled anywhere. He speaks to no one with real intimacy, trusts no one with his thoughts, and seems to believe that all human connections are temporary by nature." They had successfully trained a prince to be emotionally numb. Mission accomplished. But perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation involved what courts called compatibility theater. This was the practice of staging elaborate romantic scenarios to make arranged marriages feel like love stories. Here's how it worked. Let's say Princess Isabella was arranged to marry Prince Ferdinand. Months before they met, both children would be told carefully crafted stories about their destined partner. Isabella would hear about Ferdinand's bravery, his kindness, his noble character. Ferdinand would hear about Isabella's beauty, her wit, her gentle nature. Then, when they finally met, the meeting would be orchestrated to feel magical and spontaneous. They'd accidentally encounter each other in a garden. Ferdinand would happen to recite poetry that Isabella had been told was his favorite.
Isabella would coincidentally be wearing a color that Ferdinand had supposedly mentioned loving. Every conversation was scripted, every spontaneous moment was planned, every shared interest was artificially manufactured. The children weren't falling in love with each other, they were falling in love with an elaborate theatrical production. The genius of this system was that it gave royal children the feeling of choosing their own partners while keeping them completely within the bounds of political necessity. They felt like they were experiencing real romance while actually being manipulated more thoroughly than ever before. Princess Joanna of Castile fell victim to perhaps the most elaborate version of this scam in 1496. She was told that her arranged marriage to Philip of Burgundy had been postponed indefinitely due to political complications. Meanwhile, she began receiving anonymous love letters from a mysterious admirer who seemed to understand her perfectly, who shared her interests in music and poetry, who made her feel seen and valued for who she truly was. Joanna fell deeply in love with her anonymous correspondent. She spent months writing passionate responses, sharing her deepest thoughts and dreams. She felt like she was experiencing the kind of pure spiritual connection that transcended political arrangements. Then, on her wedding day, she discovered that Philip of Burgundy had been her mysterious correspondent all along. The entire romance had been a setup designed to make her political marriage feel like a love story. Joanna's reaction reveals just how psychologically devastating these manipulations could be. Instead of feeling grateful for the elaborate effort to help her love her arranged husband, she felt betrayed and violated. In her diary, she wrote, "They have stolen not just my choice, but my very capacity to trust my own feelings. How can I believe in any emotion when I know it might be another performance designed for political purposes?" She had been so thoroughly manipulated that she could no longer distinguish between authentic feelings and manufactured ones. But you know what's absolutely fascinating? Even these sophisticated psychological manipulations couldn't completely crush the human spirit's need for authentic connection. Some royal children began developing what we might call emotional resistance strategies. They created secret languages, hidden friendships, covert ways of maintaining real human connections despite the system's attempts to isolate them. Some princesses would communicate their true feelings through flower arrangements. A yellow rose meant "I'm lonely." White lilies meant "I'm afraid." Red poppies meant "I remember what real love feels like." Some princes developed elaborate coded correspondence systems, writing letters that looked like formal diplomatic communications but actually contained personal messages hidden in specific word choices and letter spacing. They were essentially running underground emotional railways, smuggling authentic feelings through a system designed to eliminate them entirely. And here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. Because as these medieval dating app manipulations became more sophisticated, they started to backfire in unexpected ways. The royal children who were being most heavily controlled began to develop something the system hadn't anticipated. They became expert at detecting lies, manipulation, and emotional fraud. They had been so thoroughly trained to recognize fake romance that they became incredibly skilled at identifying the real thing when it appeared. And when that happened, when a genuinely authentic connection broke through all the elaborate defenses, well, let's just say that a royal child who spent their entire life surrounded by emotional fakery knows the value of the real thing when they find it, and they're willing to risk everything to protect it. When that real thing finally appeared, it created some of the most legally complex and financially devastating documents in medieval history. Because here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize royal weddings. The paperwork behind these marriages was more complicated than modern corporate mergers and infinitely more binding. Let me show you just how insane these marriage contracts really were by walking you through one that almost started World War Medieval. In 1469, The marriage contract between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon wasn't just a wedding agreement. It was a 47-page legal document that essentially redesigned the map of Spain. And when I say 47 pages, I'm talking about dense, handwritten medieval script that would make modern tax law look like a children's book.